Amen. Looking at the subject of parable teaching, and if you recall, we started off our studies by just going into Strong's, Brown Driver Briggs, Thayer's, to look at some definitions of what parables are and how they operate. We saw that there's this concept that we obtain from this idea of juxtapositioning that allowed us to understand this principle of compare and contrast. And I'm saying this principle of compare and contrast is an important tool for us to go into Scripture and make deductions, come to answers that we may not see if we were just to read in a more casual and relaxed fashion. So I gave some examples of that yesterday. We're not going to go over the basic concept of the two warships coming together that are in tension, they're against one another, they're following the same rules. We understand about the natural and the spiritual. So I'm not going to repeat that, but if you recall that we went to a couple of Bible verses, the first one that we went to was which one? Remember?
Daniel 11 verse 4. 1.
So we went to Daniel 11 verse 41, and straight away you can see the whole tenet of the verse is the identification of two groups, and they've got a different experience. We know the one is escaping and one is overthrown. But I'm saying when you start applying these rules, what you can do is, even though it doesn't tell you in the verse, you can see a couple of things. First of all, that you're talking about the same group of people. So when I mean the same group, I mean that they're both identifying God's people. So when you pick up the characteristics of one group, you can then bring that and apply it to another group. The problem in a study like this, which is just at a prophecy school, we end up cutting a lot of corners. And even though I'm saying we're applying these rules, you will notice that we're not just using this rule, we're applying many rules, many methods to come to our conclusion. As an example, when it talks about a group that are escaping out of his hand, I'm already identifying that this is the Sunday law history, already identifying that this is the fulfillment of Revelation 18 verse 4, which says, "Come out of her, my people." So even though we haven't proven it, I'm just making the assertion that not only are these God's people because they're relative, but you can proof text that. But the point I wanted to see was not that, because that's relatively straightforward. It's to show us that the group that are overthrown are paralleling, or we should be paralleling them with the group that escape. And when you do that, you can begin to see mirroring experiences. So we understand what that word escape means. It means someone who is in prison that is now going to be free. And when you compare that to the other group, then what you realise is that there's a group that are free and they're going to go, the verse says they're going to be overthrown, but we want to define what overthrown means. And I'm saying the way the verses are structured using this methodology, you know that they're going to go into prison. We then asked ourselves, what does it mean to escape? What are you escaping from? It's not a matter of geography. You're not escaping from one location and fleeing to another, even though the imagery often is couched in that kind of language. as an example, when it says, come out of her, my people, what are you coming out of? You're coming out of the land of Babylon, and you're going back into the glorious land. And we can demonstrate that in a number of stories, particularly ancient Israel and the Millerites. So, using this methodology, when we went to verse 41, I'm saying they're both identifying God's people in two different experiences, and all of that, which I hopefully is relatively straightforward for us to see, has ramifications in the way we approach or identify or look at people. And I explain that with this following model. In the New Testament, there are two kingdoms identified. There's God's and there's Satan's. And at first glance, you might think that this would be the church and this might be the world. But what Paul begins to identify is that whether you're in the church or out of the church, a Jew or a Gentile, it makes no difference. Because according to Romans 3:9, what condition are you in?
Sin.
You're in sin, you're under sin. So in Satan's kingdom, you can have the church and the world, or the Jews and the Gentiles. And then he's going to develop another argument to show that when you're in God's kingdom, this is also the church and what I'm calling the world, although it's not an accurate term to really use that. And this is composed of Jews and Gentiles. And this motif of Paul's runs all the way through the New Testament. This is his argument to prove or demonstrate what God is now doing. And we required, I'm suggesting, to take this model and bring it into our own dispensation, our own history. So we developed this model this way, but we also looked at it in another way, if you remember. A very similar principle, but we looked at it differently. We said, if you take the 2300 days, beginning in 457, going to 34 AD, and then 1844, this is a line of judgment. And in this line of judgment, you can divide it into two dispensations. If you do the math, you'll find that this is 490 years, and this is 1,810, and this is 2,300. So all straightforward information. And Ellen White's going to comment that from AD 34, the gospel went from the Jews to the world. And we know that the Jews are God's people, so we could call this the church and the world. But when we start trying to develop this model, you end up finding that you're going to get the same model that Paul is developing here. Because when the gospel gets taken to the world, the only people that you're really speaking to or conversing with are God's people in the world. It's not the world at large. The world is actually never going to be brought into God's fold. What you're doing is you're cherry picking individuals who are in the world, who you can spot and identify as being God's people, and they're the ones that are going to be your target audience. And an easy example would be Cornelius. Ellen White will describe Cornelius as the first fruit of the Gentile converts. But he obviously is not the only one. Perhaps the most famous one that we're all aware of is Luke, the author of the book of Luke, book of Acts. We know that he's a Gentile, but there are many people. So in this story here, when we talk about the world, what we're talking about is people who serve God and people who serve Satan. So you've got these two groups here, and then when you come to the church, you're going to see the same dynamic. People who serve God and people who serve Satan. So you see this same model that we've got here, that we can take from the 2300-day prophecy, is the same model that Paul's using. This is a recurring theme. It's not anything new. So all we're doing when we come to our own history and we start targeting the church, and people say we shouldn't be doing that because we should be focusing on public evangelism, we're just taking a recurring theme that I've given you at least two examples here. There are others, to show you that God first requires us to go to the church because in the church there's a problem. Ellen White will speak about this issue either through visions that she's had, but even in their own experience. You see this same dynamic occurring. So we went to Daniel 11:41 and we saw these two groups. And the two groups that we're identifying, one is escaping, that's these people here, God's children who are in the world, and they're going to be compared to people that are in the church. Now, you remember that we spoke about doing a study at varying levels. You can do it at a simple level and then become more complex, more detailed. And when you do that, at the simple level, you know that the people that are overthrown are SDAs. The people who are going to escape are the world. So you've got the church and the world. But when you start considering who is it that is actually free in God's church that are about to be overthrown, then the dynamic becomes a little bit more interesting, and we discuss some clues about that. So that was Daniel 11 verse 41.
Pardon. Excuse me, I have a question. In which category you place the people who are not belong to any churches? Because we can see this model also, people who are not who not belong to a church and being converted. It's not the world.
So if you take someone like Cornelius, when do you identify him as being God's people? Do you identify him being a member of God's people before he gets baptized, before he meets Peter, or afterwards? I would argue before. He's already been identified as a chosen person, and all that's happening is when he meets Peter, that gets formalized. So these people who are not part of a formalized church or a religion, even though they worship God unwittingly or unknowingly in the same way that we do, they're still considered his people. I think Paul describes this group of people in Romans chapter 1 and even into chapter 2. So even though they don't have the law, they still follow the law that's written in their heart, if I can portray it that way. One thing I would comment on part of your question, I don't know if it's directly related to your question, but when we start realizing that there's some preparatory work that needs to be done in a person's experience before they can be called into God's church. So at the Sunday law, when we say, "Come out of her, my people," we now know that there's a preparatory work that's being done before. Ellen White alludes to this. A simple example would be that before the Sunday law, there's going to be an agitation. We know that things are going to be happening in the world, and we're going to give a message in response to those things that are going on, and we're going to be telling people, look, this thing that's going on is going to lead somewhere. And those words won't fall on deaf ears. So people will listen to those words and they will have an effect upon them. And that effect we might describe as an awakening or a commitment that these people are making, so that by the time you get to the Sunday law, when they have to make a decision, because they don't have to really make that an outright decision beforehand, they'll be ready to choose the right, or on the other hand, not make any decision. So the only point I want to make about that, when you say people who are not in the church, like an atheist, I'm inclined to understand that in the Sunday law period, those people will not be targeted. We're not addressing those people. It's churchgoers, it's believers that are going to be addressed and who are going to be making these decisions in the Sunday law, because it's before that that people are going to be making their decision, not for Sabbath or Sunday, but for God or atheism, which is code name for Satan. Those decisions will be made beforehand, not in the Sunday law history.
So how?
How? Well, we know that the Holy Spirit is talking to people individually, convicting them, bringing them to a place of decision. We know that. But in connection with that, it's the events that are happening in the world. People know things are going wrong. We still don't have full clarity on the interaction between us, this movement, whatever it grows to when the Levites come in, and the SDA conference structure and the world. We still don't have good visibility of how severe that's going to be, but it will awaken inquiry of these people to try to ascertain, why are these people in trouble, what's going wrong, why are they being targeted or accused for whatever. And so that inquiry will awaken an interest in those people, in addition to what the Holy Spirit is doing to them in their individual lives, bringing them to conviction. So by the time the Sunday law comes, I think, even though they may not be part of an organised church, they will still have committed themselves and given themselves to God. They're not going to be atheists that are now going to suddenly wake up and be confronted that there is a God and they need to make these decisions. All of that work is going to be done beforehand, not at that moment. My sister.
It's God has called all of us. Before you were born, He knew me in my mother's womb. So in spite of the organized church, I was called by God. And now, 12 years later, I ended up here.
Amen.
Yeah, praise the Lord. It's not because of what we do, it's what God has already done.
So we looked at verse 41. What was the next verse we looked at? Then we went to Daniel 12, verse 10. And in this one, we saw the wise and the wicked. And we can see that the wise understand, the wicked don't understand. We can proof text that the wise are teachers. We can do that from Isaiah chapter 28, which we're going to go to in a moment. You can show that those wise are teachers. It's relatively straightforward to do. But the wicked, I think more often than not, we have this mind that they're just people who have rejected things outright and have no understanding of what's going on. So I want to suggest that that's not the case, that these wicked people are not dumb people who don't know anything, that are not teachers. In fact, they are teachers, and what they're teaching is some erroneous doctrine without defining what that error is or what it looks like, whether it's moral or prophetic. I'm not trying to make that argument, but what I am saying is that they're teachers. And I'm basing that using this idea of compare and contrast. You've got two groups. At one level they're the same, at another level they've got contrasting experiences. So we looked at that, and the reason why Daniel 12:10 is a good example, I think, is because it doesn't define what wicked is. So you have to define wicked to be teachers by inference, by using the rule or the method, if we can understand that. And then we went to Isaiah 28. I think we went straight to Isaiah 28 then. We didn't skip out of that. So let's go back to Isaiah 28 and finish off some thoughts here. So we began to look at this passage, if you remember, in verse 9. First took us to verse 9. And there's a little word in the Hebrew which helps us to define who the object and who the subject is of the verse. So we know that the subject is the he, and the object is the person that is going to be used. And there's two ways of understanding this relatively complex Hebrew passage. You either can approach it, and we're going to use two simple English words. So this was verse 9. You can either see it as to or by. So if you just slip that in the beginning of the sentence, it says, to whom shall he teach knowledge, which would mean you folks, or by whom will he teach knowledge, which would mean me, in the context of a teacher and a student. And we have to decide which way is this. And it's not that clear in the verse itself. If you took the verse in isolation, I don't think there's any real way of knowing which would be the correct answer. So you have to go elsewhere to try and ascertain what it is. Is it to or by? So we picked up this this idea about weaning, and we went to 1 Corinthians, we went to Hebrews. When we went there, we saw that the people who are not weaned, who are babies, are essentially not fit for purpose. They're not competent to do what they're supposed to do. In fact, they're probably not even doing that. So I'm suggesting that when it says the people that are being spoken of in verse 9 have been weaned, when you're going to understand that, that's talking about teachers. So that's why I'm saying it's by. When you go to the grammar, I think the grammar, the intention of it was to be by. When it got translated in the King James, they translated it with the concept of to. It doesn't use the word to, it doesn't need to. So there were two arguments. Then we went to a third argument, and that third argument was what? What's the third argument that we had? Yes, so it was the argument or the logic of history. So we're going to look at Isaiah 28, in its historical setting. And when we start doing that, we can lay out a pretty accurate history of what's going on. So we did that, if you recall. We had 120 years, 977, which is not germane to our study, but I just put it in there because we've discussed that. And we've got Hoshea and Zedekiah. And these are the three kings. Saul, David, Solomon. 40, 40, 40. So we've got that. And I'm saying that you can identify Isaiah's ministry in this history here. It begins, I believe, with Uzziah, and it ends with Hezekiah. He goes into the history of Manasseh, but Manasseh kills him. So he doesn't really have an effective ministry in that dispensation. So that's where Isaiah is. And if you're reasonably familiar with the 2520 study, you could go to Isaiah chapter 7, and we will place Isaiah chapter 7 here. When you go to the king of Ephraim, and who's that? You know who his name is? In Isaiah 7? Pekah, yeah, Pekah the son of Remaliah. So he's just before Hoshea, so that's Isaiah 7. And I'm suggesting Isaiah 7 and Isaiah 28, it's the same history, you're in the same time period. Even though it's 21 chapters forward, it's all basically one narrative. It's a prophecy or a story of what's about to happen. So I'm arguing that this is Isaiah 7 to 28. And I'm not saying it doesn't go further than chapter 28. So all of that story in those 21 chapters is all happening in the history before Hoshea. So if you go to verse 1, it talks about the condition of Ephraim, how bad they are. Then in verse 2, it says that the Lord has a strong, this is 28:2, has a strong, mighty person who is about to cause damage and havoc or judgment to Ephraim. So we discussed that, and it discusses a little bit more about the relationship between Ephraim and this mighty one. And then when you get to verse 14, the story has changed from Ephraim to Jerusalem. Wherefore hear the word of the Lord, ye scornful men that rule this people which is in Jerusalem. Because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell are we in agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come to us. For we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. So what's being discussed here is that when the overflowing scourge comes to Ephraim, that this punishment is not going to come to Jerusalem. That's what their argument is, because they've made this agreement or this deal with death. And then verse 15 and onwards, basically God is going to respond and say, you know, don't fool yourselves in this trickery, because when the overflowing scourge is going to come to Ephraim, the 10 tribes, it's going to come to you as well. So we commented on all of that, and I just want to go back to verse 2. So yesterday I made a mistake. I just want to correct that, because when we start talking about parables, we understand the natural and the spiritual, and I had them flipped around the wrong way. So the natural is the storm, the flood, the hail, and the spiritual is actually the strong, mighty one. Should be that way round. So I'm sorry about...
Wasn't it different? It was, I thought it was a stronger, mighty one, and Assyria. Talking about Assyria. No.
Yes, yes. I'm not saying it's not Assyria. I'm just saying I had these flipped the other way yesterday.
Yeah.
This is the right way. So...
Sorry, how did you come to that correction?
I knew I'd made a mistake yesterday straight away, but the
Alright.
class had ended by then, so...
Aaron mentioned the storm here as natural. Brother Aaron.
Yes, he mentioned that, and I said it was the other way. This is correct. I'll give another example of that in another book. So, verse 2 is actually not that straightforward, because it doesn't really identify Assyria. But we'll put Assyria here. I'll give you a couple of other Bible verses to demonstrate what's going on. I mentioned that Isaiah 7 here and Isaiah 28 is all one passage. If you keep your hands in Isaiah 28 and you go to Isaiah chapter 8, verse 7. Isaiah 8, 7. You're going to get the same setup, but here it's not going to be called the strong and mighty one. It's actually just name the nation. Now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria, and all his glory, and he shall come up over all his channels, and go over all his banks. So what's being described here is a river that's overflowing, and I didn't put the word overflowing, but it's here in Isaiah 28. In Isaiah 8 it's described as a river bursting its banks, and it tells you what this overflowing river is. It tells you straight that it's the Assyrian nation. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I see it's the other way around.
That this should be there, and that should be there.
So I don't understand when you put it.
Okay.
I can't read that top one, and I didn't hear what you said. Right there.
This is natural and spiritual.
The spiritual.
Storm, flood, hail, overflow.
Strong, mighty,
Mighty.
strong.
Strong.
This says strong. It's the mighty one,
Thank you.
and it's the Assyrian nation. So if we went to Isaiah 8 verse 7, Sister Shemaine, where would you put them? Where would you put them?
When I will put what?
Isaiah 8:7.
Yeah, natural and spiritual. You mean?
Yeah.
So I will put Assyria, and after flood,
Which would be the natural and which would be the spiritual?
the king of Assyria will be the natural.
So the Assyrians would be the natural.
Ah, wait, no, it doesn't mention. No. The flood is compared to the king of Assyria.
So
The flood is a natural,
yes,
and it's compared to a man, the Assyrian.
yes. Just like you'd get a sheep, you look at a sheep and you say that sheep
Yeah.
is a symbol of a man. When you look at that river, it's a symbol of a nation or a man. So you could, I think it's clear to see in Isaiah 8 that it would be this way. So a strong and mighty one is actually a human being. If you know, the imagery is of a human being. So it's comparing a storm or a river. So if you looked at that storm outside, you said, what is that storm a symbol of? That storm is a symbol of a strong person. So the strong person would be what you're trying to show, and you're going to illustrate it by the storm. So the storm would be the natural pointing to the spiritual.
So maybe because it's starting in Isaiah 28 by the mighty one, so maybe that's why I pick up this as a natural and compare it with the flood.
Yes, and that's what I did yesterday, unwittingly. Just read the verse in the wrong way because you normally structure it the other way around. Let me give you another one. I think I've got another one. No, I had another verse. We know this Assyrian is Shalmaneser. It's the King Shalmaneser. Just naming the king, what his name is. You can find that in 2 Kings chapter 17. 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 3 to 6. And it's describing this story. I'll read verse 3. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents. And then it talks about... Sorry? 2 Kings 17, verses 3 to 6. And if I drop down to verse 5, then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. So this is the siege of Samaria from 723 to 721. 723 to 721. That's that history here where we've got this H for Hoshea, and it's Shalmaneser that's doing that work. So we know that it's the Assyrian nation. We have historical evidence, both secular and biblical. And this Assyrian nation, the king, Shalmaneser, is being described with these natural elements, a storm, a flood, a hail, things that are going to be overflowing. So hopefully that's cleared that issue up. And the point that we wanted to make from all of that was that we know verse 2 is the 10 tribes, and we know that verse... I should have actually just said verse 1 really. Verse 1 is Ephraim, and we know that verse 14 is talking about Jerusalem. So we know that it actually mentions them by name. And then from verses 15 to 19, so we've got 15 to 19, this is paralleling verses 2 to verse 4. Because in verse 2 to verse 4, it's all this imagery here. The tempest of hail, the destroying storm, a flood of mighty waters overflowing, casting down to the earth. They're going to tread them underfoot. All of this imagery is brought to view in verses 2 to verse 4. And this is being targeted at Ephraim. And we know who's doing that work. It's the strong and mighty one. We don't know that it's the Assyrian nation in this chapter. We have to go elsewhere. But in the chapter, it tells you it's the strong and mighty one. So we know it's the personification of a person. We know it's a person. In fact, if you go to verse 2 and you cut out the middle section, so I'm going to read verse 2, I'm going to cut out the middle section and read the first part and the last part. So you'll see it. Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which shall cast down to the earth with the hand.
Where is that?
Verse 2,
28.
28, so 28 verse 2. So I'm just reading the first part of the verse and the last part. I've chopped out the middle part. Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which shall cast down to the earth with the hand. Are we okay with that?
Yeah.
So the question is, this strong and mighty person who has a hand, so all this is real language, what is he going to cast down to the ground? What's he going to throw to the ground? Sorry?
The earth
He's going to throw the earth to the ground?
shall cast the to the earth.
He's going to cast a hail to the ground?
That's the people.
He's going to cast the people to the ground?
Oh, the drunkards.
The kingdom, the Ephraim,
He's going to cast the kingdom to the ground. Okay, so
the banishment.
if we go to verse 1, woe to the crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is a fading flower, which are on the head of the fat valleys, of them that are overcome with wine. Someone say something?
The pride.
Okay, so what is the pride? It's their crown. So there's going to be a king that's sitting here in Ephraim, specifically Samaria, because Samaria is what? According to verse 1, it doesn't use the word Samaria. What is Samaria? It's the head. So this is the head of the fat valleys. The fat valleys are the rich pasture lands, the wealth of the land. So what's going to happen is the strong and mighty one is going to come and he's going to take that crown and do what with it? He's going to cast it down to the ground, which means he's going to take it off of the head of Ephraim. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, specifically identified if you're going to go to an individual king as Hoshea. So he's going to go to Hoshea and take his crown off. So verse 2 is all this language of a real person, this strong and mighty one who has the ability to go to the head of Ephraim, which is Samaria, and cast the crown, which is this crown of pride, to the ground. And he's going to do it with his hand. So you can see, I know there is symbolic language in that that's couched in there, for instance, the subject of the hand, but it is this, it has all the language of being a real person. So you've got this real person, and he's been described as all of these natural elements which are destructive. So when he comes to Samaria and he takes the crown off, basically destroying the capital of the nation, what does that look like? It looks like a storm that comes and sweeps away this people. So are there any questions on the natural to the spiritual?
What would the earth be?
I think I didn't want to go deeply into this passage because what begins to be described, the way they've translated this in the English, is the Hebrew has a play of words, because when it says, I don't know if you've got it on your computer, if you check, when it says cast down to the earth, what does that actually mean? When you cast down? It's 51:17, if you're looking. It means to rest.
Yeah.
So there's symbolic language in all of this that you can start talking about the land is going to receive its rest. But the ground here is, I think, in its natural sense, that the crown is going to be taken off someone's head and it's going to be brought low. To me, that's what that idea is being portrayed here in verse 2. What we wanted to do was, the reason why I brought all of this up is because in verses 2 to 4 here, it tells you it's a person. But when you get to 15 to 19, it just uses the same language. In those verses, it talks about an overflowing scourge, the hail, the waters shall overflow, the overflowing scourge shall pass through, you're going to be trodden down. All of that language is very similar to what's being used here, and by using compare and contrast, I'm saying it's the same strong and mighty one. So, this person here is the same person that's going to come here. They're the same people. This is the king of the north, and this is the king of the north. If we're okay with that concept, that's what this methodology will allow you to do. It's not guesswork, and it's certainly not logic. The reason why we're discussing this is because we get accused of using logic, and we're not sticking to a thus saith the Lord. And I'm saying people who are using those arguments, occasionally they may have a point that we do use logic, but the vast majority of the time it's not logic that we're using rules and methods that perhaps we're not even aware of. Certainly they're not aware of them, that there are these rules to use. And because we're not aware of them, we can buy into this concept, yeah, we're just using logic to do this. And I'm saying it's not logic. These are rules that are inbuilt into Scripture, and when we become familiar with them, not only are we allowed to use them, we're supposed to use them. This is not guesswork, this is proper Bible study. It's not your opinion that maybe this is the same person and maybe it's not, because it doesn't say who this is. But using parable teaching, using the methodology of parables, you know that it is so. Just like 11:41, just like 12:10, and the same with Isaiah chapter 28. So that was the reason why I wanted to go there and to discuss that.
Okay, so now Isaiah 28. Now we should explain it by whom, not to whom. Verse 9.
Yes. So I just went through the order of things. So what we did was there are two compare and contrast that we're going to look at in Isaiah 28. One of them we've looked at is the king of the north. That's one. And another one we're going to look at is verse 7 and verse 9. So we looked at that as well yesterday. So we've done verse 2 and verse 15. We've compared and contrasted those. They're both the king of the north. And now we're going to look at verse 7 and verse 9. So before we did verse 9 with this application, just want to remind us that if you run through the context of chapter 28, then in chapter 28 it says that he's going to teach his people some things. And what he's going to teach them, or by whom is he going to teach them, it tells you in verse 11. For with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people. So when you tie in verse 11 with verse 9, it's another witness, another evidence, another line of argument to show that verse 9 is by whom. By whom is he going to teach this thing? He's going to teach it by people who speak to you in a foreign language. So I'm saying contextually, verse 9, these people who are going to teach you something are none other than the Assyrians. It's the Assyrians that are going to teach you something. Now I say the Assyrians, but I want us to be careful. If you remember, because technically it's not the Assyrians. Remember we did this. we had verse 1 and verse 14. And verse 1 is Ephraim, and verse 14 is Jerusalem. And I'm saying somewhere in between that, there's a transition between between Ephraim and Jerusalem. We need to find the target verse, so that when we do that, we can know, when we go to say verse 9, these teachers, who are they teaching? Are they teaching Ephraim, or are they teaching Jerusalem? So we need to know who they're teaching. So I don't know if you've ever looked at that, or how you'd make a decision. How would you decide what the transition verse is? Where would verse 7 go? Would it go here, or would it go here? Does anyone even understand the question? Sister Cedric? No? We know the chapter begins with Ephraim. By the time you get to verse 14, he's speaking to Jerusalem. When did he begin to speak to Jerusalem? Which verse begins the discussion that deals with Jerusalem, no longer with Ephraim? When does he switch to say, I'm talking to Ephraim, Ephraim, now I'm talking to Jerusalem? We might assume it would be verse 14. That would be a natural assumption, that from verse 1 to 13 is all Ephraim, and verse 14 onward is all Jerusalem. But I'm suggesting it's not that. A part of the argument would be that if you go back into the history, the priests and the prophets, particularly the priests, we know that the golden calves are set up here by Jeroboam. And what do all the priests do? I say all, and may not be 100%, but it says it in the context that the priests, they refuse to do what? They refuse to officiate in the system that Jeroboam is setting up. So all those priests, what do? They go back to Jerusalem. They refuse to participate in Jeroboam's apostasy. So they all go to Jerusalem. So what does he end up doing? I think Elder Jeff even mentioned this yesterday. He sets up new priests from common people. Yeah? So he breaks that law that God has already set up, which is important because you get a breaking of the law here historically, and I'm going to argue, Paul's going to argue, in the time of Christ what's going to happen. You're going to break the same law, and you're going to get what kind of a person to become a priest? A common person. Who is that common person? That's Christ. Christ is just a common person, nobody who's not allowed to be a priest. So you see these parallels. Okay, so I'm basing that based upon that idea. When it talks about priests and prophets in verse 7, where are the priests located? Because now they're drunk, which would infer what? They're drunk now. What were they before? They were sober before, which means they've gone from good to bad. Now those false priests here that Jeroboam is going to be setting up, they weren't good and then become bad. They were never priests. They were just normal people who become bad priests, if you like. So it's not the same dynamic. So you know that verse 7 must be which locality? Ephraim or Judah? Judah. It has to be Judah or Jerusalem. So you know verse 7 is already in this part of the history. So I'm going to suggest that it's, I don't know if anybody's got an opinion, which verse the transition happens. So we discussed this already, you may not have noticed. Let's go down to verse 15. We just read verse 15, and the reason I'm pointing to us to verse 15 because yesterday someone said a different answer, and I just want to clarify this. Because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death and withheld a agreement, when the overflowing scourge shall pass through. When is that going to happen? Because yesterday someone said the overflowing scourge is going to be here in Jerusalem. This is verse 15. I'm suggesting not. I'm saying verse 15 is being discussed here, and it says, when this thing happens, you think you will escape. What is the thing that's about to happen? We know it's the scourge, but who is being scourged?
Ephraim.
This is Ephraim that's being scourged. It says, when you see the scourging here, you think it's not going to come to you. It's not going to come to Jerusalem. It's partially true, because when it happened to them, it did not come to Jerusalem. When does it come to Jerusalem? When? 46 years later. 46 years after verse 15, then it does come to them. This is in the reign of Manasseh. It's not Shalmaneser, 46 years later, when the Assyrians come back the second time, and then when they come back the second time, what's their purpose? They're going to depopulate the land. They're going to take all the 10 tribes, those Jews, take them out of their land, and they're going to bring new people in. So we know that, and when they do that, they come south, and they come to Jerusalem, ravage Judah, go to the capital, take Manasseh, and take him back where? To Babylon. They take him to Babylon, which was their temporary capital. So I'm saying verse 15 is this event here, when Hoshea is taken. When you see Hoshea taken, you've made a covenant, it says with death and with hell, to say that we are God's people and death won't touch us. Who is death? Who is death in this context? This is the Assyrians. This is it's not Shalmaneser now, because it's it is Shalmaneser in this case, because this is 721, 723. When that event happens, Shalmaneser, the killer, the death person, isn't going to touch us. So they're saying, we've made a deal with the Assyrians. They didn't really make a deal with the Assyrians. There was no negotiation. This is just metaphorical language. So if we can see, if we're happy to accept that verse 15 is this event here, when this one happens, then they're going to escape. And then the narrative says, don't worry, you will be destroyed. The overflowing scourge will come to you as well. It's going to come here in Zedekiah. So if we drop back to verse 2, we've gone to verse 2. A strong and mighty one is going to come who looks like a storm. Verse 3. The crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, shall be trodden underfoot. Okay, with that. Verse 4, he's going to say the same thing, just in different language. It's a different parable. The glorious beauty which is on the head of the fat valley shall be a fading flower. And as the hasty fruit before summer, which when he that looketh upon it seeth it, while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. What did we say the hasty fruit was? First fruits. I'm not guessing that. If you go back into the Hebrew, that hasty fruit is the first fruit. So we know that Ephraim is what? The first fruit, and Jerusalem is the harvest. So we've got that relationship, and it says he that's going to get this fruit in his hand is going to eat it up. Who's the he?
Assyria.
This is Assyria. This is, if you want to put a name to it, this is Shalmaneser. He's going to take the fruit. What is the first fruit? This is Samaria, the head of the fat valley. He'll take that into his hand and he'll eat it up, destroy it. Verse 5. In that day shall the Lord of hosts be for a crown of glory and for a diadem of beauty unto the residue of his people. What day is that when it says in that day?
When it will happen.
That's this date here.
Yeah.
723, 721. When that event happens, that destruction, then what will the Lord be? He'll be for a crown of glory and for a diadem of beauty unto the residue of his people. Who are the residue? Judah, Jerusalem. This is the residue. So I'm saying it's verse 5, which is the transition from the story of Ephraim to the story of Jerusalem. Then verse 5 and verse 6 are tagged together. and for a spirit of judgment to him that sitteth in judgment, and for strength to them that turn the battle to the gain. Verse 7, but they also have erred. Who are the they that also have erred? This is the residue. There's a promise that's been offered to the residue, but the residue have committed the same crime as Ephraim. But they also have erred through strong wine and strong drink. They've gone out of the way. The priest and the prophet, which are where? Which part are they located with? With the residue. The priest and the prophet are with the residue. So that history that we've discussed is all in agreement with just a simple reading of these verses. So we've got verse 7 here, the priest and the prophet. So the priest and the prophet are supposed to be instructing them, but they're not going to instruct them because they're making mistakes. Then he gets to verse 9, he says, if the priest and prophets are not going to instruct you and teach you, who shall I get to teach and instruct you? And going to verse 11 is the answer. I'm going to use teachers to speak to you who have a foreign language. And who is that? This is the king of the north. I've said the Assyrians, but technically it's not the Assyrians that are going to be doing this work. It transitions from the Assyrians to the Babylonians. And we can demonstrate that. But at the level of using the king of the north, it's the king of the north that's going to teach you this. So it's Babylon that are going to instruct you. And can we demonstrate that the Babylonians understand visions, which makes them prophets? Can we demonstrate that? Yes? Where? Where would we go?
In the story of the birth of Jesus with the Magi.
So the people that come from the east, that come from Babylonia, they understand the vision of Balaam. Numbers 23 and 24. Sister Shimela?
Daniel chapter 1, 2 and 3.
So the Babylonians understand visions and dreams?
I was thinking of the internet, sorry. The soothsayers, I think they're called.
But the soothsayers can't interpret the dream. They don't know.
Sorry,
Sister Debbie?
Yeah, I was thinking of the Cyrus.
Cyrus, who's a Medo-Persian, comes from the kings of the north.
Yeah. But I think he understood what God wanted him to do, that he needs. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way now.
Brother Magic?
The only thing that comes to mind is they knew about Jeremiah. They knew what Jeremiah was talking about.
They knew about Jeremiah.
Yeah.
magicians, astrologers. That was the vision.
Sister Ruth?
Daniel 8:23.
So we go to Daniel 8:23, and in the latter time of their kingdom, when their transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. So we identify this as Rome, pagan Rome, or papal Rome, depending on the context of how you're going to read that passage. But he understands dark sentences, and if you look at what those dark sentences means, this is another way of saying riddles or proverbs or parables or the vision. So this king that's going to stand up with fierce countenance, he's going to understand this parable. Another passage? Daniel 11. So Daniel 11 verse 14. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. So again, Rome, robbers of thy people, the breakers of God's people, are going to establish the vision. How can you establish a vision if you don't even know what the vision is? You don't even know your role in that vision. So we have good evidence to show that Babylon understands visions, and at that level it would make them prophets. Prophets being people who tell you God's words or instruct you in God's words.
I think Herod certainly did when the slaughter of the innocents.
Yes.
Of Jesus, he really acted on that vision.
And are they priests? What's the role of a priest? In verse 7, Isaiah 28, verse 7. Sister Sophie? Judgment. They bring judgment. They bring correct judgment. And correct judgment means you know the good people and you know the bad people. You know who's good and who's bad, and you can distinguish between the two. And you don't make a mistake. Did the Babylonians have that ability?
Yeah.
They certainly do. Because when they go to Zedekiah, what do they do to him?
Put his eyes out.
Poke his eyes out and kill his sons. And when they come to Jeremiah, what do they do? Sorry?
No.
No, the Babylonians.
They free him?
They free him. Before they enter the city, they say, go and find Jeremiah. We know him by name. And when you find him, do whatever he asks you to do. So they're able to bring correct judgment.
That's okay.
Are we saying
Sorry?
Ezekiel 9.
So then we can come to, we'll go to Ezekiel 9 in a second.
I'm just asking where you're talking about verse 7 for Babylon. Just now.
Verse 9 and 11. In 28, 9 and 11. I'm saying verse 7 are the priests and the prophets who live in Jerusalem. The true priests and true prophets. They're no longer fit for purpose. So they're going to make mistakes in the vision. And what they're going to say about the vision? Ezekiel 12.
Oh, that's not coming.
It's not coming. Habakkuk 2. They're saying, get off that tower. There's no enemies coming. Everything's good. Isn't it? Habakkuk 2, verses 1 to 4. What's the argument? We'll go to Habakkuk 2.
He's slow to...
Habakkuk 2, there's an argument. Verse 1, I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower and will watch to see what he will say to me and what I shall answer when I am reproved. Who's reproving Habakkuk? Who's arguing with him? I think it's the Jews that are arguing with him. What's he doing? He's standing upon a watchtower. Why?
Because something's coming.
To watch for whom? The enemies are about to come. And all the false prophets are saying what?
Peace and safety.
Peace and safety. There's nothing happening. You're wasting your time doing that. So when he stands upon the watchtower, they're going to reprove him and argue with him. Because they've erred in vision. Ezekiel 9. We'll go to Ezekiel 9. And in Ezekiel 9, you have 6 men who are in charge of Jerusalem. They're in charge of Jerusalem before Jerusalem is destroyed. If you want to go to the study of those years, we know that they besieged Jerusalem. I think it's 18 months, the besieging. So they're already in charge of Jerusalem long before the besieging. But even if you just mark it from the siege, in that siege, we know that the Babylonians control and run Jerusalem. The 6 men come from which direction? They come from the north. And what are they going to do? At least one of them is going to mark the people. So how do you mark people? You must be able to bring judgment upon them. And we know that's what priests do. They judge people. And they're going to have a foreign tongue. In all of its historical application, in its original setting, this is all talking about Babylon. And what do they do here? Depending if you want to go, say, the 5 or 6 men, what do? They slaughter everyone who's not, doesn't have the seal of God, who weren't sighing and crying. Who does all the slaughtering in the history of Ezekiel? It's Babylon that's doing that. So I'm saying there's strong arguments to show then when you come back to Isaiah 28, verses 9 and 11, these teachers, these priests and prophets, is Babylon that's going to be doing this work on behalf of God. And what we do is make an application of that. We take that all around and we make an application. So in the next presentation, we just quickly review what we did about making the application of particularly the priests, not the prophet, because I think that's an interesting phenomena that we need to be aware of. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness, for your watch care over us. Lord, as we study and delve into your word, it's my hope and prayer that each of us, and also us as a corporate body, begin to become aware and familiar with the use of the rules and methods that you've given to us to interrogate your word. We ask for a blessing upon our continued study. In Jesus' name, amen.